right, great. So welcome. My name is Jen Turner. I am the co-founder of TCTSY and so happy to be here and to share with you. But first, we can start with a little body practice, maybe to remember we've got these bodies we're carrying around. So when you're ready, again, you're welcome to have your camera on or off always. And we could have your eyes open or closed, possibly taking a moment to arrive, to acknowledge that you made it here. And even taking, these next few moments as time and space for you to tend to your body, which might be following along with kind of what I'm offering. It might be doing something else in your space or moving in a different way or sending that last email, whatever you like. But if you'd like to join me in movement, one way we could move might be shifting your spine from side to side. And here you might shift from side to side. You could pause. You might also shift forward and back. Perhaps this movement also becomes circular at some point. Circles could be smaller or wider in range, always your choice. Maybe moving in both directions if you'd like. And again, as you're moving, you're always welcome to pause somewhere along the way. Maybe there's a feeling or sensation you want to stay with. And then at some point, a possibility to arrive back at center. Another way we might move could be moving in your spine. So if you wanted to, you could kind of scooch forward on your chair just so you have a little bit of room. A possibility from here that you might round your spine. So kind of curling your shoulders forward, possibly dropping your chin if you'd like. Kind of rounding even in your middle or low back. And then you could sort of shift into an opposite sort of shape by lengthening, lifting your chin if you'd like, maybe arcing your back or expanding through your shoulders. And you're welcome to move between these two shapes. They could be separate and distinct, like kind of two different shapes. Or maybe you start to link them together. Again, it's your choice how you move or if you move. Continuing if you'd like. Maybe for 3. And 2. And 1. So from here, we could begin to shift back toward our collective, but you're more than welcome to continue to move or shift your body however you'd like. You're always welcome to tend to your embodied experience. So I'm really excited about this conversation here today with Noelle and Lucia. I'm going to spotlight you both to add you in here. Um, these the facilitator spotlights are really an opportunity to share some of the amazing and beautiful work that's happening in the world and bring to life this embodied somatic work that our wider community is doing. Also to potentially offer inspiration or creativity or ideas for all of you who might be in various stages of your journey with TCTSY. Um, So rather than speaking on their behalf, I would love to invite Noelle, Lucia, whoever wants to start first to sort of share a little bit about the work that they do in the world, and then we can kind of dive on in. So I don't know, Noelle, you want to get us going?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Noelle Spring, my pronouns are they or he. I live in Detroit, Michigan, and I'm a somatic trauma therapist. So I practice TCTSY, of course. Also, I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner, and I also work a lot with attachment and sexual and sexuality trauma.
Hi everyone, I'm Lucia. I am also a trauma therapist, but I work with children and adolescents primarily at the Chicago Child Trauma Center. In that work, I do some stuff with TCTSY and then a lot of other modalities we found work well with kids who've experienced trauma. I also have a second job where I work at a nonprofit called the Latina Sweat Project here in Chicago. It's a really exciting movement we've started where we're trying to make yoga more accessible for the community, particularly the Latino community, because we're based in a Latino neighborhood. And we're just trying to normalize serving that community. And we're also really focused on creating BIPOC wellness leaders in general. So that's been a really exciting place to find a home and to find a space for TCTSY as well.
That's great. Love this. Okay, so maybe we can just jump on in. I know this actually wasn't so much in the questions, but I'm sort of thinking it might be interesting for folks to hear a little bit about how each of you found your way to TCTSY. I don't know if that would be all right too. Either one, we can just flow.
I can start this time. So back when I was in grad school, I did grad school over in Boston, where obviously TCTSY comes from. And one of my supervisors during my internship was a TCTSY facilitator and had kind of planted the seed and made me feel interested in it. And then years later, I was fortunate enough to do the foundational training with Jen and David and Cristal. And then I did the certification program in Spanish, which was really, really great for me because I had done all my training in English and I do practice bilingual therapy. So getting some of that language in Spanish was a really exciting opportunity for me, a really challenging opportunity for me. And I think having that cohort in particular made me feel really drawn to becoming a facilitator and completing that certification.
Yeah, how did I find TCTSY? So I kind of welcomed myself into the world of somatics through an independent study I did and a study abroad that I did in my final year of my MSW program. I was studying empowerment models for survivors of sex trafficking. And we traveled to Kolkata, India, and learned from some really incredible women and organizations there. And so I was doing a lot of research into what are the current best practices for supporting survivors of sex trafficking. And through that independent study, I didn't find a lot, first of all. There was just not a lot of research. But what I kind of found over and over is anti-oppressive practice and somatic focused modalities. And so I wrote my master's thesis on that. And as I was exploring that, also recognizing kind of the place for my own healing. So I have complex trauma, and I was like, oh, okay, so this somatic stuff, I've read about this embodiment, it sounds so cool. And then approaching it for myself, was the most significant part of getting into this work. And so reading into all of these different modalities, somatic practice, I'd been practicing yoga for a long time, about a decade at that point. And I think I might have been reading like The Body Keeps the Score, something like that, and reading about yoga as a pathway for recovery. And that's how I found TCTSY. I did my 20-hour foundational in person in Louisville, Kentucky. I believe the trainer's name was Allie,
Yep.
and I had already done a couple of trainings before that, like professional trainings, and they'd gone really badly, just in regards to making space for one, people of non-dominant identities, i.e., myself as a trans person, but also like bringing in the structural component or the recognition that trauma is political. And so I got into this 20-hour foundational, and at the end of the weekend, like I was talking to Allie and I was just crying because I had not been in a space like that in any of my trainings, where one, I felt like I actually belonged, and two, the in the training space, Allie encouraged everyone in the space to really center the idea that if we're working with trauma, we need to be looking at the political and structural issues of it. And so at that point, I was just like, I found my home. And, and then, yeah, I was just like, of course, I'm doing the 300 at this point. It was great.
That's amazing. That's so great. I mean, it makes me think too, after this call, reach out to Allie and just say, hey, like if,
Hmm.
'cause Allie's amazing. Um, Well, that sort of like helps kind of prime the conversation in general around, I think one of the things, for everyone who's here with us is we really wanted to talk today a lot about sort of the bigger picture in the system and even the healing system and the way that causes
Mhm.
harm. So I guess maybe we can start with that. I don't know if you want to just kind of keep flowing with it, Noel, but like, curious to hear your thoughts about the assumptions um, that the sort of mental health complex in general, but like around healing, care, and trauma that are out there that really exclude certain people, and whether that's personal experience, things you've observed. Love to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I in so much of my training, it's just the construction of a lot of the modalities that I practice come from a white, cis, straight, lived experience and perspective. And I think that like that in and of itself, right? So it's like even if there is an intention within both modalities, and I would also say just theory around what we do, as long as those spaces are dominated by people who all look the same and move through this world in very similar ways, the blind spots are incredible. It and they don't realize it. And so I think like such a big part of this is we talk about this a lot, like, okay, how do we bring in more people into positions of leadership and teaching and creation of these programs who actually embody experiences that are different? And I think that embodiment piece is huge. Because specifically in programs that I've been in, there have been some that have kind of attempted to make space or to touch upon these ideas, but I can feel when the embodiment is not there. And I think a lot of people can feel when the embodiment is not there. And so that's kind of where I've been floating around, like in my body and head around these things lately.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question, but Lucy, I want to kind of hear from you too, to chime in because I know you've got things to say.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I love what Noelle said about bring that into the leadership space as well. I think that's something that, like I said, drew me to TCTSY in the first place, is even knowing that there were leaders in the space that spoke my native language, that were making it a priority to have people of color, have people from different backgrounds, from different countries be leaders in this space, and cater to creating more leaders. I think was really important to me, and something I found at the Latina Sweat Project, like I was talking about, and just that emphasis in it's not only important to create space for those individuals to find care, but also for them to be leaders in this space and for them to be the providers themselves. And so I think that's something that definitely has been a big piece for me. I think Noel spoke well to kind of these more general things that exclude people, but I think there's also just like really concrete barriers. I work a lot with like immigrants and refugees, and there's just like cost and accessibility and things like that that just really prevent people from accessing any type of care, really. And so I think those barriers have been something I've been really passionate about trying to break down in any way we can, whether that's language barriers, whether that's the cost of something. When you're working with undocumented folks, right? A lot of people don't have insurance. So how do you get around those barriers to help people access care when those people are often the ones who need the most healing and care, right? And so I think, you know, there's this general broad sense of it. And then there's also these really specific, concrete ways that we can slowly dismantle that and create space for people to heal.
I love that. I find that helpful too. It's like what to concretize some of these things. And, I wonder too if we can dive more deeply into the embodiment piece as well that you were mentioning, Noelle, and like, what's it, even to move through a body that bears as much privilege as mine does, what is that like and what might I miss or and maybe the experiences that you've seen of creating spaces where different bodies are tended to or welcomed because of who is designing the class, creating the model, all of that.
Yeah, I think you speak to something really important there. I think like when we are creating spaces and we want to invite in people of all different identities, there's a difference between saying, "Hey, you're welcome in this space," and "You belong in this space."
Mm,
And so when we look at kind of how structural oppression has been exacted onto us, it has been intentional. It has been systematic. There has been unfortunately, a lot of deep thought, intention, direction toward reinforcing power and oppression. And so I think when it comes to creating spaces, I think we need to be just as intentional, just as action oriented. And so, for example, creating a space of belonging. So if I'm doing something, let's say I'm hosting a TCTSY event or a practice or whatever, there's a big difference between me, saying, yes, people of all identities are allowed, and what if the next step was, yes, of course, all identities are allowed here, but I want you here. And how do you know I want you here? Well, I'm going to offer scholarships for people for BIPOC and LGBTQ folks. That's how much I want you here. I'm going to do this and this to ensure or try to ensure. Obviously, we can't fully ensure that people feel safe all the time, but I'm going to take these very concrete steps to try to ensure that there's space here for you to belong. And those might look like very specific things, I work mostly with trans folks and I'm trans, so that's very easily translated. There's a lot of trans talk, for me. But there's ways in which I take concrete actions to ensure that people of all gender identities are not just welcome, but that they belong. So, yeah, I'm going to introduce myself with my pronouns. I'm going to be careful about my language. I'm going to be careful about gendered language. I'm going to walk in once again with kind of this embodied experience of who I am, what I've gone through, and also the intentional work I have done within my body to create spaces of belonging.
mm, so beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think going off of that too, I love what Noelle said about making people feel welcome. And I think a big piece of that is not only like creating a modality or a space, and then as an afterthought, adding other people into it, which I think is what we've largely seen in like the world of psychology, right? It's like we created this modality that's evidence-based, and now after we've proven it on white people, we're going to try to go prove it on someone else. And then we'll make a training separate so that you can know about this one population, right? But what if we included people from the get-go, right? Like what if those spaces were included and not only inclusive of, but created for that
Mhm.
population, right? Like when I walk into a space, Is there art that reflects my culture in this space? Is there music that is playing that reflects my culture in this space? Are people feeling like this space wasn't only inclusive of them, but created for them, right? And I think that's a really big difference is when we just like add something in as an afterthought, right? When we create a space and we're like, everyone's welcome here. And then the only way we're doing that is we're saying, oh, we're doing something for Black History Month only in February, right? Like, what does that mean, right? What about the other 11 months of the year? And so I think when we're creating something from its inception, that really encapsulates all people or whatever population you're trying to target. That's a felt experience, right? Like you feel it in your body, you feel it as
Yes.
you walk into a space.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that differentiation of yeah, you can feel when a space is created for you versus an afterthought. Definitely had that experience a lot. Hmm.
I think for me that the thing I worry about as well is like is the harm that happens or the like tokenistic quality that can happen when it's sort of like, oh, we should add this in, like you're saying, Lucia, we should like make sure that we're inclusive rather than, I mean, we see this a lot with complex trauma on the whole as well, right? When we look at research, and I think that was such a big, inspiration for us in the beginning of our work with TCTSY was like, how do we actually take this cohort of people who have experienced trauma that are kind of sidelined by trauma treatment because it's like, oh, treatment resistant, it's too difficult. We're going
Hmm.
to like pathologize this community with personality disorders and really center their experience in the development of this approach because how do we know if they're treatment resistant if treatment wasn't designed
Yep.
for them, right? It's like it's powerful. Yeah. And I really like what you said too, Noelle, about like the belonging, but not only just like you're welcome, you belong here, whatever, whatever, but like actually I would like you to be here.
Hmm.
And how do I communicate that? I think also, for me, I hosted a few years ago a 20-hour foundational training that was just for people who worked and had not exclusively, they didn't have to, but definitely worked in the LGBTQIA plus community and had a lived experience. That was sort of like the
Hmm.
encouragement. And I think what was so interesting for me as someone who certainly is cisgendered and like doesn't have a lived experience and can pass in all kinds of ways that with other identities that I carry, it's like, how do I prepare myself to hold that space at that point? I didn't have someone that I could say, actually, you'd be a better fit for this training, which is, I think probably would have been better to co-facilitate. But I think also, it's sort of like, how do we show up as providers or caregivers in that space and continue to learn and ask for input without asking people to do emotional labor? That's where I kind of get all like tangled at times. That was the foundational training I offered was really fascinating, but and I learned a lot and I prepared a lot too. I guess some of, my maybe I don't even know if I have a fully formed question, but I guess I'm thinking about, if someone is working and wanting to welcome more lived experiences, what are some suggestions or encouragement that you might have around um, preparing for that, creating those spaces? I can imagine a lot of it is about leadership and like who's actually facilitating, but a lot of folks that we train work in really, really rural areas where there's limited folks able to lead in these ways at this point in time.
My first thought there is getting really comfortable with taking accountability.
Mm,
Like what everything we're talking about, right? I'm talking about it in an embodied way. So like what can I do to support my body to be able to hold me through moments when I mess up so that I can still show up with my feet on the ground in my sense of self while also being with the other person or persons who I harmed. I think that is just so central to this type of work is that ability to take accountability because we're gonna mess up. And how do we be with that? How do we move through repair because repair, as we all know, when we're doing attachment work, is so deeply healing.
Mhm. Love that.
Think also we might get into this a little later, but also just thinking about like intersectionality in this piece too, right? Like I'm Latina and I'm also white, right? And so I'm not going to walk into a space and pretend people don't see me that way or that I don't move through the world in that way. And so I think acknowledging all those intersections and the ways in which we can welcome people and, utilize our privilege and our senses of connection with other people, right? Like I'm a woman, you're a woman, let's connect in that regard. And then also acknowledge like our other identities and privileges and how we can use those
Mhm.
as a strength, right? And advocate for others and create space for others, and also take accountability and also take into account how others' lived experiences might be extremely different from our own.
Hmm. Hmm. I love that. Yep. Yep. I wonder too, Lucy, if you can continue to like share more about this, about accessibility. I loved the conversation I got to have with you a few weeks ago around the way that your organization is really working to take concrete steps to bring in or break down some of those barriers. So could you speak to
Yeah,
some of the ways that your organization and the work you've done has made this more accessible?
yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, I think we've worked really hard to really focus the conversation on accessibility. The organization I work for does all types of movement, not just trauma sensitive yoga. I'm the only one who does that piece of it, but hopefully not for long. Um, but just making yoga accessible in general, like as an example, we have a yoga teacher training program that's completely free of cost, and usually that costs
Mm.
several thousands of dollars. And we just graduated almost 50 BIPOC yoga leaders, and it was no cost to them, right? And that means a lot of hard work on our end to like create that space and make that accessible, but that means that it's possible, right? That means that um, not every yoga teacher training has to cost $5,000, and only center people who are able to afford that, right? And so I think um, when you look at the percentages of people who lead spaces versus the people who assist spaces, those percentages are really uneven. And creating spaces like that, you're kind of moving those percentages up a little bit. I don't want to quote this, but I think like in the yoga space, broadly speaking, there were only like 3% ish of Latino yoga facilitators in any way. But the amount of people who were attending yoga classes, right, was maybe like 30%, right? And so as we kind of change those percentages, we're just creating accessibility in and of itself. That means people are hearing music, hearing languages that they understand and relate to in a way that they might not be able to in other spaces. So I think that's been really huge. And like I was saying before, just like creating a space from its initiation that is created for a certain group and they feel at home in that group. We've made a really big effort to have bilingual classes, to have classes in Spanish, to make classes accessible to other people. I think in the same way that the Center for Trauma and Embodiment kind of has these ways you can decide how much you're able to pay for something. That's kind of a model we've taken into account as well, because we think it's important for those that can pay a full price to attend a session or to do whatever type of movement we're engaging in, right? Can do that and also help their neighbor who isn't able to do that for whatever reason. And so when we're creating those spaces, we're creating equity, and we're creating accessibility at the same time, and acknowledging that um, yoga isn't just the practice that you do for 45 minutes when you enter a class, right? It's like really the way you live in a lot of ways. And when we're thinking about all those branches and things we learned about in our TCTSY training, we're thinking about that too, right? And how can you really like live out that practice in ways that makes that accessible to other people, and where you're really practicing non-harm in a way that's true in all aspects of your life, not for 45 minutes and that's it, right?
Absolutely. It's like walking the talk, it's embodying the belief system and yeah. Anything else that you wanted to sort of add in, Noel, other ways that you have found in your work to like break down barriers and access, and increase access?
what's been on my mind around increasing access is going to different spaces or creating different spaces that aren't so entangled with or associated with harmful institutions. And so, like, I can almost like separate this into yoga and therapy. I can look at both. And so, like, yoga, of course, we associate yoga with a yoga studio, and yoga studios have been spaces of harm for people of many different identities. I know for myself, um, being trans, there are yoga studios that I don't go to because they're very gendered. You know, there'll be a lot of classes where it's going to be mostly women and the facilitator is going to be like, "Okay, ladies." And so I'll avoid I will avoid a yoga studio until I know that that is a space for me. And so what if we just take yoga out of the spaces that have become associated with harm or that people don't trust and put it in other places? So I think with TCTSY, for example, or yoga in general, as we bring yoga to different spaces, as we bring yoga to community centers, as we bring yoga to libraries, as we bring yoga to LGBTQ spaces specifically, as we bring yoga to parks, I think that in and of itself breaks down a huge issue of inaccessibility. Um, Therapy is, I think, a kind of the other half of what I do. And yeah, therapy has very thick walls around it for many different reasons around accessibility. But kind of similar ideas, how can I in my practice challenge or subvert the ways that the mental health industrial complex has colored what therapy is for people? How therapy inherently is a power dynamic, right? How can I do some things to subvert that? So one of the things that I've done is where I practice therapy. I don't practice therapy in an office setting that people might associate therapy with. I have a very unique space. The location of my office is like in an actual community, like I'm not in like an office area. Um, I think there's so many ways that we can open up accessibility, but those are just a couple that have been on my mind lately.
I think Noelle too, when you're talking about that, it reminded me it's not just accessibility, but also like a sense of safety, right? Like you were
Yes.
saying, like you feel safe in that space
Hmm.
when people are using language that, right? It's not just accessibility, it's safety, and I think that's been a big piece that has been very present on our minds in the past year and change, especially like working with immigrants and refugees and undocumented folks. Um, is like, is this place feel safe for you to enter? Do you feel safe while you're in this building? Do you feel like ICE is going to knock on the door in this building, right? Do you feel like people are
Hmm.
trained and know what to do in that situation? And so I think that's been this like really increased factor we've had to think about in a really new way, right? Where we're thinking about a lot of different types of safety and like not
Yeah.
just emotional safety, but like literally physical safety of
Yes.
people as well.
Yes. Yes. Back before I was on my own practicing therapy, I was like going and looking at different office spaces that I was interested in renting. And one of the spaces I went to, it was in a suburb of Detroit. So that's already kind of like, okay, I need to be a little careful with what I'm doing here. But, I walk into the building that this therapy office is in, and as soon as you walk in, there's a security guard. And I was immediately like, absolutely not. Like, people of color who I see for therapy would never feel safe walking into this building past an armed security guard. And so it's things like that. And once again, it was one of those moments where it's like, okay, so the majority of people who walk in here for therapy services don't think twice about this because they're not uncomfortable by the security guard. They feel safe by the security guard. But how might someone's identity be coloring that illusion of who makes me feel safe and who makes me feel not safe?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's part of that, like, how can we layer on the different a different lens or multiple lenses and And part of that is seeing things from others' perspective or bringing in our own lived experience. And I know that both of you sort of have already talked about it, but you know, I'd love to hear maybe more about how your lived experience has informed your work, continues to inform it. One thing that I love that I feel like is I'm seeing more of, although it's still just in the pockets that I get to exist in and share space with other providers, but I do feel like lived experience is becoming more of a central focus rather than just learned and educated experience. But I guess I wonder, what does that look like for you, whether it's TCTSY or other practices, in terms of you kind of bringing your own intersectional identities, your own lived experience into the work and how it informs your work?
Where to begin? Lucia, are you ready? Are you ready to go?
There's so much here.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I can start. I think I spoke to this a little bit right when I was talking about like intersectionality and that piece, but I think especially working with kids, we talk about these like ports of entry and points of connection, working with their caregivers and the children a lot. And so I think again, like latching on to those moments of connection is so important. And we know that TCTSY and a lot of modalities are based on attachment theory. And I think that's a big piece of it, right? Is like forming these moments of connection. Like for example, when I work with kids who migrated here and are experiencing a lot of pretty challenging acculturation factors, and I can tell them like I don't have the same migration story as you, but I experienced that too as a child, and I had to learn English and I had to go through some of these things, right? That's um, a point of connection between us. Even though we have different lived experiences, we're able to find those like little points of connection where I'm not going to pretend I ever understand their entire story or have lived half the trauma that they have lived. Um, but I can find these points of connection which build trust and understanding um, and help kids feel safe, right? And help kids feel like they can be in this space and have someone who understands at least a small, tiny little piece of their identity. And so I think that work is really important in working um, in therapy. I think also when I'm working in the therapy space, I use TCTSY a lot, not only like in doing it, but just like creating options and choices in everything I do in therapy too. And I think that's been a really cool way to weave in my own identity into the work as well, because I'm like, yeah, we could do yoga today, or we could do art today, or we could do this today. And there's so many ways that you can build that in, right? Like if we're doing art, we can build in so much culture and storytelling and all these like really rich factors into that. Even if we're doing yoga, we can too. So like kind of no matter what we're doing, like finding ways to weave in, um, their identity, maybe my identity a little bit, maybe a caregiver's identity, if that's a different identity as well, and kind of like really weave that into the work so that it's kind of like holding together everything we're doing in that space and forming that connection, that trust, and all those things that have been like highly damaged by traumatic experiences in general.
So identity-wise, I'm thinking about like my identity as a trans person and my identity as someone who has recovered from complex trauma and kind of how I bring in both of those things. And so with the complex trauma piece, like I am that person who 10, 15 years ago when I was in it real deep, I was the person who would get a borderline diagnosis. Or, I was the person who couldn't access care or didn't know like what care to access, right? Because at that point, especially not being in the field of trauma or in the field of therapy, like you have no idea like what to do. You have no idea what's going on with you. And so I think like from just my own experience of recovery through embodiment, the way that I hold that in my space, I think one of the biggest ways I hold that in that space is I always hold hope for the people who I work with. And part of that is just like I recovered from this. And I believe that you can too. And I know that because I've been through it. And obviously our stories are different, our identities are different, our social locations are different. But I have this light in me that I will always hold for you, that you can feel better in this world. Um, and then as for kind of my gender identity piece, so much can so much doesn't have to be talked about. Like that's just the very simple kind of part of it. It's just like I said, I see primarily gender diverse people for therapy. And so often there's this experience of coming in and kind of this sigh of relief of, oh, I don't have to tell you all the things. I don't have to tell you all the things you already know. You already, get it. And that creates so much space for everything else that we're actually like really there to be with and work with what that person really wants us to be with. I think oftentimes gender diverse folks go to therapy and their gender identity ends up being like the thing that's focused on when they're not actually there for that. They're there for, to work through their trauma or to feel less anxious or whatever. But now suddenly my gender is what's the spotlight in session. And so I really appreciate being able to hold space where that's your gender is not the problem. And in so many ways, and I think in very subtle ways, it's not, I think when I say that your gender is the problem, we might be thinking of like these very explicit ways that a practitioner or a facilitator might express that. But I think it's also expressed in a lot of subtle ways that once again we might not be aware of if we're not kind of embodied in this work. And also we're going to do that anyway sometimes because we're going to mess up, and then here comes the accountability piece, right? Um, but yeah, I think just having that space open is really great.
I think adding on to that real quick too, this conversation reminds me a little bit of like the radical healing framework, if people are familiar with
Mm.
that too, right? And I think the way I think of radical healing a lot too is like if I kind of encompass a lot of those pillars of radical healing, then that's the only way that my clients can do that as well, right? And so I think that's a really big piece of it, right? Is like when we radically accept our own identities, our own lived experiences. I think that that's a felt experience, right? And I think right, we're told in grad school and things like that, like you have to go to your own therapy in order to be a therapist, right? And I think in a lot of ways it goes far beyond going to therapy and being in that space and just like having this sense of like radical healing and radical hope, really.
Mm.
And I think that that's felt, right? I think you can tell when a clinician is holding that for you or when they're not,
Mhm.
or when a TCTSY facilitator is holding that for you or is not holding that for you or has kind of accepted that piece of themselves and their own experience and identity as well. Um, and I think along with that, right, is being able to do that is like an act of resistance and an act of healing. I think Audre Lorde has like a really good quote about that talks about how staying healthy in these systems of oppression, right, is the greatest act of resistance, right? And so I think holding on to that and accepting that for yourself is the way to accept that for the people you serve as well.
Mm. So,
Yeah, and another thing coming up for me is something I share with people a lot, and that is if I judge you, I'm judging myself. And I bring that in a lot because, I think when people come to either a TCTSY practice or to see a therapist, they have this idea that this person is like they especially if they're coming from a complex trauma background, there's this kind of unconscious kind of pedestaling. Um, but I hold that in my heart too, of like, I've been through some things. I've done a lot of unsavory things in my life to get myself here. A lot of unsavory things, a lot of things that would be very much looked down upon and are taboo or stigmatized. And those lived experiences that I've had to get to where I am, to survive, that creates in me a sense of, yeah, tell me whatever wild stuff you're into. Okay, yeah, if I judge you for that, I'll be judging myself. So it's almost like this really lovely kind of internal check that happens, like this embodied internal check around judgment. And so I really appreciate that kind of from my past.
I love that you brought that in, Noelle, because Lucia, when you were talking about how, you might share with a kiddo who that you've had a similar kind of experience, but it's also different, to me, what we're also talking about is power dynamics, right? It's breaking
Mhm.
down this idea that because I'm the person that's facilitating, I'm the person that's holding the space, I'm the therapist in the room, that I have all of my shit figured out. And it's just not true, right? It's an ongoing process and practice. And I always think it's so interesting to find that place where, you know, how much space do we take up in the room? How much do we share about
Mhm.
that while also not centering ourselves?
Yeah.
It's, to me, it's such a dance. There's a lot of intuition involved in that, but it's sort of like also to name the reality of like, yeah, I struggle with that too, or I've been there, or I was just there the other day.
I think that's one thing I love about working with kids is there's obviously a power dynamic there between like adult and children, but I don't have to sit in a chair all day, right? Like I was reading inside a fort yesterday, right? So I think like literally getting down on the ground with them is like breaking down so much of that
Mhm.
power dynamic. And I'm so grateful to work with children because I think it reminds me of that a lot of times where I think that would be harder for me in like a typical adult therapy space where I'm not sitting on the ground unless maybe you're doing yoga, right? Um, and that's like a really helpful reminder for me, like that I get to have every day.
I think that shared experience, right? That is so powerful. And, I certainly, when I've integrated TCTSY into talk therapy and still do, that when sometimes with some clients, we've just started to like do therapy in weird positions. It's like, yeah, I want to do legs up the wall. Okay, I'm gonna like lie on my back, and then we're not even maybe having eye contact, but we're still processing. It does feel a little more rogue to do that with adults because it's like we're not being adults here, but kids are a beautiful reminder of that. So I wanted to open up the dialogue for folks here to see if there are questions, reflections that anyone might want to share, as we're sort of cognizant of time as well. But feel free to use the chat, raise your hand, wave at me if you've got your camera on, if there's anything you'd like to reflect on.
Yeah, I guess I just want to say that thank you so much for sharing all that. That this was such an amazing conversation, really. And what really kind of stayed with me was that what you spoke about accessibility and safety, right? And also the part of like being welcomed or feeling belonging in a space. Like these are, yeah, that's something that stayed with me, and especially that kind of bit of accessibility and how can we support accessible spaces for people. Um, yeah, also thinking what makes people feel safe and belonging. The music part, the language part, where is it located, the space, what we wear or what is like offered. Yeah, so many things. So thank you.
I can say something briefly to that. I know that wasn't a question, but it just reminded me the other day when I was at the yoga studio community center I work at. Someone was leaving, and I was just like, "Hope you have a great day," or something like that. And they responded and they said, "Every day that I get a step foot in here is the greatest day." And I was like, "Wow, that's such like a testimony to like what a space can be for someone, and especially a space that's something that they can access every day, right? And so I think sometimes you don't even realize like what an impact that's having. It's someone I've seen a million times. I know they use the space a lot, right? But I think even just like hearing that from someone, um, is so powerful, right? To know that what you're doing is working and tangible and like really impacting someone's day-to-day lives. And I think that speaks to that sense of like security and safety and accessibility as well.
So incredible. You know what that reminds me of too is, a bunch of various times through the years of doing the in-person yoga sessions at the trauma center way back when we were developing this. There would be a couple of different folks periodically who would come in and they would like rest. They would sort of sleep much of the time or rest and would share that this was sort of the one place they were able to rest and really feel safe. So then if you zoom out and think about like, well, we're here for yoga, or like, why isn't someone doing yoga? Or maybe they don't like what I'm offering, as like what might run through our minds if we're not thinking of trauma and we're not thinking of power dynamics in this, but rather this was like this incredible respite for a participant, and how different that is when we can look at it through the lens of complex trauma, when we can look at it through the lens of a space that really does create belonging for someone. Um,
That is that to me is one of the most beautiful things. Like the space that I practice in is, like I said, kind of a very non-traditional office. So like I have like a day bed with like a bunch of pillows and blankets, and I have like a heated rug, and just it's a space that's really created to just like feel your body and do what you want. And times when people come into my office and they feel like they can just lay down, like that warms my heart so much because, yes, through this complex trauma lens, wow, this person feels safe enough here to let their guard down. This person feels safe enough in our relationship to do what they want to do and not ask me for permission. Like that's huge.
that's incredible. And also, can I get a link for that heated rug? That in my life.
You know, I didn't know that. I didn't know this was a thing until a friend moved in and bought me one, and I was like, wow.
Magical.
Amazing. I was just going to add to that and say I do a lot of child parent psychotherapy, which means we're doing a lot of dyadic work and the caregivers in the room with us while we're working. And I often have caregivers fall asleep while we're doing something, and I'm working with a kiddo, and the parent is fast asleep, sometimes snoring, right? Like they are at rest. And I feel like in my head, I'm always like, oh no, now they're not engaged. And now I'm not like doing the treatment plan I made. And then I have to kind of remind myself, like, wow, this is a place where they feel comfortable and safe. And they know that they trust me with their child, right? And they trust that I'm still doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And this might have been the only rest I got because their kids got a lot of stuff going on, right? And they're probably not resting a lot at home. And so I think giving yourself that reminder and that grace too of this is part of the work too. And the work doesn't always look like the textbook says, right? It rarely looks like what the textbook says.
And who wrote the textbook?
Correct.
Boom. Mic drop. Um, awesome. Okay, well, I see, if people probably have to transition at the hour, but like, is there anything else that anyone might want to just say before we kind of wrap here?
I just want to say thank you for sharing your experience with TCTSY and also the work that you guys have been doing. Um, as I'm listening to you guys share, I can't help but reflect like the reason why I decided to sign up for TSY. Sorry. And just hearing like the strength that is still moving and as we continue to do the work and also support the communities that really do need us. Noelle, I'm going to search up non-traditional office spaces because I'm trying to like picture what that looks like. But I just want to say again, like, thank you for the things that you guys are offering and also building more. capacity, and hopefully the statistics that you drop, Lucia, changes.
Thank you, Kathy. Absolutely.
Thanks, Kathy. I've been enjoying your smile through this.
Me too.
It's been giving me life.
Me too. I was feeling that too, Kathy. Excellent. Thank you all for being here. Let's see, we've got a nice comment in here. Awesome. Thank you so much to each of you for your time and energy to put the conversation for the community. Deeply grateful, relatable, and enlightening. Thank you so much, Joanne. I felt your energy too. You're nodding, your heart's right there with us. So thank you all. Um, and thank you, Noelle and Lucia, for inviting us into your world and sharing more about what you're up to, and for doing this amazing work that you do in the world.
Thanks everyone for coming and being a part of this. This has been really nourishing for me today.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I love feeling connected to this space. Sometimes I just pull up the little TCTSY facilitator map and see how many little dots are across the globe, and it gives me a little bit of hope.
That's right. That's beautiful. All right. Thank you all. Take care.